Minnesota Twin legend is now in the Hall of Fame. Scotty Braun, AJ Pierzynski, and Ken Rosenthal. So, Ken, first off, on the writer's side, were you surprised that he gets in right from the jump? I mean, he is definitely a more hotly debated subject because some of the counting stats are certainly not there, although they're not there for many catchers, but he had a unique career.
He did have a unique career, and that was why some people thought maybe he wouldn't do so well in the voting his first time around. What happened to him, obviously, we all know the concussions, and that forced him to first base, and it changed things dramatically. But when I look at my ballot and when I start judging which players I'm going to vote for, the first thing I look at is tenure dominance. That's my first prerequisite. Not every player meets that, and I still vote for some who don't. But that's the one thing I really like in a Hall of Famer. Joe Mauer had that, and he had that at one of the game's most demanding positions. During his time at catcher, those 10 years, he won Gold Gloves, he won 3 batting titles, he won an MVP. Now, did he win playoff games? No. Did he hit a ton of home runs? No. So you can look at that and say, all right, this is not a great profile, but those 10 years for the number one pick in the country, which he was when he was drafted, for a guy who stayed with his team the entire career, his entire career, I just felt that was more than enough because catcher is such a difficult spot. It's a difficult spot to judge, but it's a difficult position to play. And to me, he passed the bar, even though, of course, his career did not end the way he wanted it to.
We got a Twins catcher on here, so what do you have for us? 143 dingers. That's where he's going to get dinged, obviously, AJ, but he gets in. And the slash line sexy, the credentials, obviously, with the All-Stars, the Gold Gloves, etc., the 10-year peak. What do you think? And also, what can you tell us about, playing in a time period that Joe was around?
Listen, Joe, I thought Joe would get in. I didn't think he'd get in on the first ballot, so it's a little bit surprising that he's going to get in on the first ballot because of the things Ken mentioned. Joe was the guy who replaced me in Minnesota. He went on and stayed there his entire career. He grew up in Minnesota, and he had an unbelievable career with the Twins. He deserves to be in the Hall of Fame if you look at that 10-year career, and he's going to get in. And that's great. That's awesome for Joe, and I'm very happy for him and his family. I think the thing that we need to look at is those, like Ken said, put those 10 years, 8 years, 9 years, whatever you want to say, when he was a primary catcher, the 3 batting titles that he won, no other catcher had done that at the time. The MVP he won, the home runs people ding him on, but he wasn't a home run hitter. He was more of a line drive to left, 2-strike approach kind of guy. But listen, he had a great career, and now he's going to the Hall of Fame. So congratulations, Joe. And hey, if you're going to get replaced by somebody on a team, it better be a first ballot Hall of Famer.
I will say this. So, AJ, do you feel like I'm sure I know the answer here, the position is underrepresented? Because I will say on my end, when I first thought of him and looked at some of just the basic stats, I was like, I don't think so, or at least take a while. And then I started to get convinced from articles, from stats, from just remembering what he did do when he was in his prime. And yes, I think this is where, wins above replacement can help. 7-year peak was high. His overall number kind of passes the bar in terms of who's around. And then I'll mix in one stat after. But don't you think in general that position just doesn't get enough love?
Well, of course. I mean, as being a former catcher, of course I think there should be more catchers in the Hall of Fame. But the numbers are hard because you can't really add up counting numbers because you don't get to play as many games as other positions. So that's why, especially with Joe, you really have to look at that 7 to 8 year run that he had and what he did because he played so many games at first base. He DH'd so many games. He had so many injuries where he couldn't catch anymore that if you have to look at the 7 to 8 year peak, I mean, yeah, he was one of the all-time best for those 7 or 8 years. But like Ken said, I think that's why people look at it and say, man, I don't know if he's a first ballot guy. He's definitely a Hall of Fame guy, but a first ballot guy because that's supposed to be special because of all the other games and how many years he spent at first base. And if you add up the counting stats, which are usually what is the most important thing for the Hall of Fame as just a catcher, they're not very high, but people took that 7-year peak and thought it was good enough. So again, congratulations to Joe. I'm happy for Joe and his family.
One thing that's changing here, Scott, and it's really difficult for voters as we go through the process here. How do you judge players whose careers were curtailed for one physical reason or another? Chase Utley falls into that category to some degree. David Wright was on the ballot this year. He falls into that category. Dustin Pedroia, he'll be on the ballot next year. And AJ's right. Counting numbers have been, in the past, what we went to first. 3,000 hits, 500 homers, 300 wins for a pitcher. It's changing. And it's changing because the careers are kind of evolving differently. The game has changed. Players aren't playing as much. Starters aren't used the same way. So these are things that we're going to have to account for. And it seems to me that the election of Mauer on the first ballot is perhaps a signal that this trend is going to change to accommodate some of these players who were in these situations. Now, you can go back in history and say, whoa, what about Don Mattingly and others in the same category? And these are fair questions. And Jason Stark put it best when he wrote this in The Athletic. As the game changes and as the way we view the game changes, voters have to evolve with that. And it seems to me that is what is happening here.
Yeah, and I liked the stat Jason put up. I know different dudes in different positions, but premium positions, he put up Ernie Banks with a 138 OPS plus. So just looking at the hitting as a shortstop, and then he had that second stage of his career as a first baseman. Who he was more league average. Mauer had the same kind of numbers there at first base, but at catcher during that time period, 135 OPS plus. I mean, he was worlds better if you're going off a stat like that hitting wise than most of the rest of the catchers during that time period. So it is interesting. And yeah, AJ, maybe we do have to look back a little bit to some of the guys that got their careers cut short in the past.
Agreed. I think Ken brought up some great names. Don Mattingly, some other guys that became injured and couldn't finish it off. So I think by now we're getting in, it's going to open it up, especially to like the Veterans Committee. They got to take a look at some guys who maybe got injured, maybe didn't play as much as they could have. But everyone looks at a Hall of Famer differently. Ken has a vote, I don't, and so it's just a personal preference. And my favorite line that Ken said was, he played the whole career in Minnesota. Does that make you a better player, Ken? I couldn't figure that one out, but congratulations, Joe.
It does, AJ, it doesn't make you a better player, but it does tell you something about the player. And also, it's the Hall of Fame. Now, granted, we judge it mostly on statistics, but fame in my head is always part of it. The fact that he was a number one draft pick who was a lifetime player for the Minnesota Twins was such a huge part of their identity. That to me matters. It doesn't matter as much as the statistics and all the tangible accomplishments, but it does kind of figure into my thinking.
I will say, and this is a different topic for another day, and we'll move on, but Johan Santana, former teammate of his, you start to look back and you're like, damn, I mean, he was the best pitcher for a little stretch there, and it was a shorter career than most would have looked at for the Hall of Fame. But I don't know, it's just guys like that maybe you look back on. Topic for another day. But for now, the lifetime twin, Joe Mauer, is in the Hall of Fame. First ballot guy. Congratulations to him. And for more coverage, obviously, of the Hall of Fame and basically anything else in baseball, real talk, Scotty Braun here, Ken Rosenthal, AJ Pierzynski, and many of our other friends. You can catch us on Foul Territory or on Ken's own Fair Territory.